Welcome to the leather workshop. Since this is the first video I shoot in here, I thought I might come up with a reasonably cool project. And I have this reasonably cool knife with a not so cool sheath. So I thought I'd make a better one. Let's see how it goes. I have a piece of leather here. It's vegetably tanned. That's what you need if you want to wet shape it. It's been sitting in the workshop for a while, so it has some stains. Doesn't matter, I will dye the sheath when I'm done with it anyway. So I'll cut out a piece big enough to wrap around the knife. Now I want the sheath to go quite far up on the handle. Not all the way, of course I have to be able to draw it, but maybe 2/3 or something. So I will have a fair amount of margin on the side of the knife as well, because I have some ideas of mounting straps and stuff on it. I don't know yet, but it's good to have a lot of extra material if you have a big piece of leather. Very rough cut. Now I'll put this in water, pretty warm water, but not hotter than I can put my fingers in it, because the water penetrates the leather more quickly if it's a little bit warm. And then I'll shape it around the knife. You can see a lot of air bubbles coming up from the leather, and also here it's sizzling. And it becomes a lot more flexible right away. You don't always need to soak the piece of leather you are working with all the way through, but when you are wet shaping it, like for knife sheath, then you really want that. If you're stamping patterns and decorations on the surface, then you only need to wet the surface really, but when you want to shape the entire piece, then it needs to be thoroughly soaked. Now the sizzling stopped. Just to make sure I leave it a little bit longer in here. This is just a piece of kind of paper you cover your floor with when you're redecorating or painting. I found a version that doesn't have any plastic surface, which is great for making templates and stuff, but right now I'm just using it to not get too much water on the cutting table. I need to wrap this in plastic before I wrap the wet leather around it, since I don't want it to rust. Maybe this is a stainless blade, I don't know, but these brass fittings and the handle that I believe is made out of leather, that would probably not react so good to being wrapped for a longer time in wet leather. I usually use clean film for this, but I don't have any at home right now, so I just took a plastic bag. Pretty sure that will work too. Right, here we have it. So I'm leaving quite a big margin here by the tip. It's more than an inch, I believe. It's like, yeah, 35 millimeters. Whatever that is in imperial, I have no idea. Doesn't really matter. Now I just wrap the whole piece around here like that. Nothing fancy, nothing complicated. Trying to pinch the back a little bit. Actually, I can do another thing before I put the knife in there to make the back pinch a little bit nicer. Cobbler's hammer, and just hit it a little bit. You could also use a press roll if you have that. I happen to have both, so I'm just using both just to show you really. Right, knife goes back in. And now it's more or less a matter of shaping it with your fingers, really. There are some tools you can use to make the imprint here by the guard. I'll see if I can find any. This could be useful. It's for decorational work, really. But I think I can use that to press in here as well. I don't want to make any sharp lines, and if I use my fingers too much, then my nails will probably get in there, and then you get these kind of marks. I can do a little bit with my fingers. But not that much. If I use this, it's like a small spoon-shaped tool. Then I can press in a little bit more precisely. So I don't want to make ugly imprints in the leather, so I will have to be a bit careful with it. See if it works. Okay, That's enough of that. Now it's really just a matter of clamping the piece together around the knife and let it dry. I'm using these small clamps. I'm not putting them too close to the blade because they will make marks in the leather, and they are made of steel, and that will also make dark spots. That's what happens when wet leather reacts to steel. Just keeping it together a little bit like this. That's about it, really. And to my experience, when you let the leather dry partially, then it's easier to shape it and make it retain the shape. I was a teacher on a school where I had some friends who was teaching leather crafts and, well, tannery mostly, and she was using a term I think she invented herself. She called it sausage dry. Like when you touch a moist sausage, then your leather is just as moist as you want it. Well, she was speaking about that in terms of tanning, but I think it can also be used when you are doing wet shaping. It's a little bit too wet now, it's very soft, it just bends and it doesn't stay in the shape you put it into. But when it's, if you want to call it that, sausage dry, then you can press it and it sort of stays there a little bit more willingly. So I'll leave this and let it dry up a little bit, and when it's sausage dry I'll press a little bit more and shape it a little bit more, and then I'll just let it dry completely, and then I'll take the knife out and we'll continue from there. How many clamps do you need? Always one more. It's a good thing to have the leather workshop in an old kitchen, as you may have noticed that I have. Then you can use the oven, for instance. So I decided to speed up the drying process a little bit with the help of that. It's totally fine to do that if you are careful with the temperature. I set the oven for well, no more than 70 degrees Celsius, because that's the critical point when leather starts to be destroyed by heat, really. So if you set it somewhere between 50 and 70 degrees Celsius, I prefer to keep it up close to 70 because it takes forever otherwise. And just pay close attention to it so it doesn't get too hot. Then it can be very helpful. And I took it out now when it is not completely dry, but as I described it before, sausage dry. I think we'll stick with that term. And now it will be much easier to keep working with, both when it comes to wet shaping it and also continue with the glue and the sewing and all of those steps. So I'll take the clamps off now and continue. I'm just making sure that there's no dampness left on the knife. Looks alright. Now I can insert it back in here. And now the leather is a lot more malleable. I can probably just use my fingers for the most part. Should be enough, I hope. But I can also go back to using this tool if I want a sharper line here. You get a little bit sharper shapes with it and can press in a little bit more. I will also use the press roller a little bit. Now when the leather behaves a little better. Open the leather piece up and trace the contour of the blade and also the rest of the handle. The reason for that is that between these two layers I will insert a third layer. It's called a welt. If I just sew these pieces together, then the cutting edge of the blade will most likely cut the seam and the sheath will fall open. So you have to have a third layer in between here, so the sharp edge touches leather and not sewing thread. Trace the blade without, preferably without drawing on the blade. From this point out, you have to make sure that there is room for the guard to pass out through the sheath. So you can't make a turn and make the welt like that, because then you won't get the knife in there. But it will have to go like that. I have to leave some space here so I can get hold of a knife handle. 2 fingers would be good, I think, so maybe here. And that's like there. And to make sure I don't make the sheath too narrow here, I'll just have to pull the knife back to that point and pinch together here and try to estimate the plan is to leave space outside of the edge for putting straps through the edge. So there will be an inner seam, maybe like there, and an outer seam somewhere here maybe, and the sheath will go out to here. So I'll just measure that and transfer that width all the way along the blade and make some sort of a step here and continue to this point. always like to have good margins, so as you can see I cut quite far outside of the line. That's because I want some excess material on the welt sticking out here. Like that, more or less. So I can just trim it down when I sew it together. And if there's just like a millimeter sticking out, it's not so easy cutting it nicely. But if you have a couple of millimeters or quite a lot like this, it's much easier to make a nice cut. That probably gives me as little waste as possible. There are basically two ways to mark on leather. You don't use a pen on the hide side. That's not good practice. You can use an awl like this. If you really want to use a pen, you turn that around and you mark on the flesh side. Because if there are any leftovers from pen markings and you cut another piece for something else, or if you cut so you leave the line on the piece you are using, then you will have that showing on the outside of your work. You don't want that. So pen on the flesh side, or scratch it with an awl if you do it on the hide side, or whatever it's called, can't remember right now. The nice side, anyway. Now that should fit in here. In the best of worlds. Yeah, I think it will be alright. Now it's time to glue these pieces together. First I scratch the surface of this side up because it's way too smooth for any glue to stick to it. You can use a regular contact glue for this if you want to. The one I'm using is specially made for shoemakers and saddle makers. Sticks a little bit better than regular stuff. But as long as you're also stitching the stuff together, it's not really that important with a strong adhesive. There are certain leather cements that you can stick stuff together with and also take apart if you need to. I don't use them myself, I only use this contact glue because I like to keep things simple in certain areas. There are multiple interesting choices when it comes to be loose in the world of leather working. Blowing on it helps a little bit if you want to stick it together quickly. There we go, that should work. That's one thing I could do to make it fold a little nicer here, and that's to just thin it out a bit at the tip. The knife has a pretty thick blade and the leather is also pretty thick, so it's not strictly necessary. It would make more of a difference for smaller knife blade and thinner leather, but it doesn't hurt to help it along a bit like that. Now I will mark out where the inner seam will come, the seam that will run closest to the blade. There will be one inner seam and one outer seam, two parallel seams. And to do that I will just draw a line on the template. And I don't want the seam to come too close to the edge of the template, because of the cutting edge of the knife blade that will probably, or maybe at least, cut into the welt a little bit. I'm keeping the line like 4 millimeters in from the edge. And to mark it, I'm placing it on top of the sheath, and I just trace along the line I just drew. And when I remove the template, there is a vague line from this, so I will just deepen it. Time to stitch it up. Waxed linen thread. A couple of tools that I keep in this pouch. It's easy to just bring along when I want to go somewhere. It's a remnant from when I was doing medieval and Viking Age markets a lot. Here's an awl, diamond shaped. Not really diamond shaped, but it has cutting edges. It's good to punch holes in thick layers of hard leather. Pair of pliers for pulling the needles. Scissors for cutting the thread. And a little needle house that I made. Just a little tube with some cloth wrapped up, and this is my travel storage of different needles, and also a few old tips, because this is replaceable. Just twist the handle and it comes loose, and you can change it for these other ones here. 2 saddler's needles is what I need now. They don't have a sharp tip. They have a dull tip because you make the hole with the awl before you sew. There are also saddler's needles with sharp tips, but I don't use those. Just prick myself on them. Okay. To estimate how much thread you need, you more or less take the length of the piece you want to sew and take that times 4. with little extra, so you have some leftovers to tighten the stitches some. And since I will make 2 passes, I will estimate this a little bit more than 4 times and do it twice. Hopefully it's enough. To thread the needles with this waxed linen thread, you squeeze the thread between your index fingertip and your thumbnail and pull the thread back. That makes it flat. Much easier than to get it through the eye of the needle. And how much you pull through, it's depending on how long thread you have. Something like that I think is okay for this. When you're done with your seam, you leave some thread in the needles, because if you drop the needles on the floor or outside, it's much easier to find them. And it's quite important that you pull the same length of thread through the eye on both needles. So you just check that. I'm almost ready to sew, but not quite. First I want to cut away the waste material on the sheath. I can probably put the knife in here already. That should probably work. I won't cut the waist of the welt before I have stitched it, but I just felt like doing it up here. I don't really know why. It's not strictly necessary. Now I can sew it together. There is a special trick to this if you want to do it really nicely. I'm not marking out the space in between the holes because I have been doing this like 20 years or so, so I'm pretty confident I can keep an even distance between stitches. Right, I usually make 4 or 6 holes with the awl in advance. When you're ready to start stitching, you don't necessarily start in your first hole, you start in the second hole. Pull both ends of the thread, holding the 2 needles parallel, so you know that you have the same length of thread on each side for each needle. And then you go back to the first hole. First needle goes through, and I save a little loop, and then I put the other needle back through. Stop when I put the needle through by half. And then I pull on the loop to make sure I haven't stuck the needle through the thread. The thread should run unhindered backwards through the hole. When I make sure I have done that, I twist the thread 1 or 2 turns around the needle to make a lock stitch. 1 or 2 depends on how thick material you are sewing through. Since this is 3 layers of pretty thick leather, I can easily do 2 turns. And then I pull out the needle and pull back the slack from the other side. And then I tighten the stitch. Doing so makes each stitch become a lock stitch, and you also make a nice diagonal seam that's really pretty, provided that you turn the sewing thread in the same direction on every stitch. I turn it clockwise. And this is a little trick to help you sew faster. Put the first needle through, and on the other side you catch it with the second needle. Put that needle across your index and long fingertip, put it from underneath and pinch it from above with your thumb. So you make a cross, and that helps you to pull the needle through. And then you don't pull the thread all the way through, but you stop, save a little loop as the first stitch, and then you just twist your grip, which makes the other needle point to your workpiece. Put that through halfway as before, stop there and pull the loop. When you can do that, you haven't accidentally put the needle through the thread, then you can twist it and pull the needle through and tighten the stitch. And the master way of doing this is to also have your awl in your hand. So you just make a hole, move your needle in front, make the stitch, keep the needles in between your fingers at the same time as you maneuver the awl. I usually don't do it because it's a bit tricky. I usually make the holes in advance, a couple of them, 4 or 6 as I said. But the sewing action I use all the time. And you learn it pretty quickly, and it just becomes second nature. There you go. Then I just keep doing that until I reach the end here. Go up, follow the outer edge here, and I finish at the tip. I didn't take a long enough thread. Maybe I should have calculated 6 times the length and not 4, because the material is so thick. So then I have to fasten the thread and take a new one, and the way you fasten saddler's stitch, as this is not by making any knots or anything. You just stitch back through the same holes 2 or 3 stitches, and then you cut the threads off and take a new thread and continue. And this is where it can be handy to have a pair of pliers for pulling the needle, because when you've already stitched through the all holes once, then it's a lot tighter to get the needles through again. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't, but it's very good to have a small thing like this handy for that situation. I will settle with 2 back stitches, then I just snip the thread off and cut a new one. Okay, that's the sheet all stitched up, and the knife fits nicely. I want to put 2 straps around it so I can mount it in various ways. And to do that I need to punch slots here and here. Rawhide mallet with a lead weight inside, suited for slightly tougher punching. This slot is about 25 millimeters. I want to punch from both sides to make the slot nicer. Right, I punched all the way through, but anyway, I'm punching from this side too to widen it from this end. There we go. And the second slot here. nice. And I also want 2 holes down here if I want to put some sort of cord through. One on the tip and one inside of that, like here. And I'm punching those from the other side too, just to widen them and shape them a bit from that side, make the whole thing look nicer. So there we go. Right. Now it's just a matter of trimming off the excess here and treat the edge, make that look better. But that's for next time. It's late and I'm done for today. It's a good start, isn't it? I think so. It's going to be a really cool sheath in the end.